A town will forgive a man for his silence, but it will never forgive a woman who refuses to explain herself. That's what folks used to say about Red Hollow, a place small enough that a stranger's footsteps could be heard clear across Main Street and remembered long after the dust settled. It sat there between dry hills and stubborn wind, where porch boards creaked the same way they had for 40 years, and every window held a pair of eyes that didn't miss much. People in Red Hollow believed they understood things quick. They liked their stories simple, their judgments quicker, and their conclusions final. So when Ethan Hayes rode back into town with a woman no one had seen before, riding quiet behind him on a borrowed mare, it didn't take long for the whispers to start. She didn't look like much, not by their measure. Her dress was plain calico, faded at the seams, hem dusted from travel. No jewelry, no trunk worth speaking of, just a single worn valise tied behind the saddle, leather cracked from years of use. Her hair was pinned back without fuss, the kind of practical knot that said she cared more about keeping it out of her way than being admired. And her face, well, folks wouldn't have called it pretty, not in the way they liked to talk about pretty. It was quiet, steady, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed and didn't flinch when it wasn't. She kept her eyes forward as they passed through town, not meeting a single stare, though there were plenty to meet. Men leaned against the rail outside Mercer's general store, hats tipped back, watching like they were studying a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Women paused mid-conversation, hands still on fabric or flour or whatever they'd been tending, their voices dropping just low enough to sound polite, just loud enough to be heard. Ethan didn't slow. He didn't tip his hat or offer explanation. He just rode straight through, same as always, boots steady in the stirrups, shoulders set like he had no interest in what anyone thought. That alone was enough to make people uneasy. Ethan Hayes had always been a man folks kept a respectful distance from. Not because he was unkind, but because he didn't waste words and didn't ask for company. He worked his land, kept his fences standing, paid what he owed, and stayed out of everyone else's business. That kind of man didn't ride into town with a bride unless there was a reason, and Red Hollow didn't like reasons it couldn't name. By supper time, the story had already taken shape in a dozen different ways, each one a little sharper than the last. Some said she must have been all he could get. Others said she'd trapped him somehow. A few decided she was nothing more than a mistake he'd learned to regret before the first frost. No one asked her name. No one thought to. Because in Red Hollow, a woman like that didn't arrive with a story worth hearing. She arrived with a judgment already waiting for her. And the strangest part was, she never once tried to change it. When Ethan led her down from the saddle in front of his place, just past the cottonwood bend, she stepped onto the dry ground without hesitation, like she'd already made peace with wherever she'd landed. She took in the small house, the weathered boards, the quiet yard, the kind of place that held more silence than conversation, and she didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't say a word. Just reached back for her valise and followed him up the porch steps like she belonged there, like she had always known she would. There is a certain kind of quiet that settles into a house that has not known two voices in a long while. And Ethan Hayes' place had carried that kind of quiet for years, the kind that lived in the corners and clung to the rafters, the kind that made every footstep sound louder than it ought to. And when Clara stepped inside, she did not pause like a guest would, did not look around like she was measuring what she had walked into. She simply set her valise down by the door and moved as if she understood something about the space that had never been spoken aloud. Ethan hung his hat on the same peg he always used and crossed to the wash basin, expecting the usual stillness to meet him. But there was a shift already, small enough a man might miss it if he was not paying attention. The window had been cracked just an inch, letting the late afternoon air drift through, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and something softer beneath it, like dust settling after a long ride. Clara stood by the table, her hands resting lightly on the worn wood, not claiming it, not asking permission, just standing there with a kind of patience that did not feel like waiting. Ethan poured water over his hands, the sound sharp in the quiet, and when he looked up, she had already begun moving again, slow, deliberate, as if each step had been decided long before she took it. She found the cupboard without asking, opened it, and took stock of what was there: beans in a tin, flour in a sack tied tight, coffee grounds kept in a jar that had seen better days. Nothing unusual, nothing abundant, just enough for a man who lived alone and did not expect more. She did not comment on it, did not look disappointed. She simply nodded once to herself and reached for the kettle. Ethan watched her without making it obvious. The way a man watches the weather roll in, not sure yet if it will bring trouble or something he has been needing without knowing it. She filled the kettle from the basin, set it on the stove, and struck a match with steady fingers. No hesitation, no wasted movement. The flame caught, small at first, then stronger, and the sound of it filled the space where silence had lived for too long. He should have said something, should have asked her what she thought she was doing, should have reminded her that this was his house and things were done a certain way, but the words did not come, not because he could not find them, but because nothing she was doing felt wrong, just different, and different had a way of unsettling a man more than wrong ever could. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, leaves whispering against one another, and somewhere in the distance a screen door slammed, the town carrying on with its business, already shaping its stories about the woman who had ridden in without a word. Inside, Clara set 2 plates on the table, not one, not as a question, not as a favor, just 2 plates placed side by side like it had always been that way. Ethan noticed that more than anything. The second plate, simple tin, worn at the edges, catching the last of the daylight. From the window, he had not used 2 plates in longer than he cared to count, and for a moment, something tightened in his chest, not pain exactly, but the memory of something that had once been familiar and had since gone quiet. Clara did not look at him when she set them down, did not wait for approval. She just moved back to the stove, stirring the pot as it began to warm, the smell of coffee rising slow and steady, filling the room inch by inch, changing the air in a way that could not be undone. And when she finally spoke, her voice was low, even, like she had measured the words before letting them go. She said supper will be ready soon, and it was not a question, not an apology, just a simple truth laid out between them. Ethan pulled out the chair across from where she had set the second plate and sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. He rested his hands on the table, rough palms against worn grain, and waited, not because he had been told to, but because something in the room had shifted just enough that waiting no longer felt like something a man did alone. Morning in Red Hollow did not arrive all at once. It came in slow layers, lights slipping through the thin curtains, the creak of wood warming under the first touch of sun, the distant sound of a wagon rolling over packed dirt, and inside Ethan's house, it found something it had not found there in years, movement that did not belong to one man alone. Clara was already awake when the sky was still gray, the kind of gray that sits low over the hills and holds the chill a little longer. She moved quietly, not out of fear of waking him, but because quiet seemed to be the language the house understood best. The stove came to life first, a small flame coaxed steady with patient hands, then the sound of coffee beans being ground, slow, even turns, each one measured, each one deliberate. Ethan lay in the loft for a moment longer than usual, staring at the beams above him, listening, not fully aware yet of why he was listening, only that there was something different in the rhythm of the morning, something that did not belong to the past. He had grown used to. He pushed himself up, boots finding the floor, and climbed down the ladder, the wood giving a familiar creak beneath his weight. Clara stood at the stove with her back to him, her sleeves rolled just enough to keep them from the heat, her hair pinned the same way as the day before, nothing about her asking to be noticed, and yet the room felt fuller for her being in it. He reached for a cup without speaking, and she poured the coffee before he asked, the dark liquid steady. No spill, no hesitation. He took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment, and it was the kind of contact that might have meant nothing in another place. But here it settled into the morning like a small shift in the wind. He sat at the table, the same place he had sat the night before, and noticed the plate already set, not as a question, not as a gesture waiting for approval, just there, as certain as the chair beneath him. She moved between stove and table without looking at him. For instruction, eggs in a skillet, the soft hiss of heat meeting metal, a piece of bread warmed just enough to take the edge off yesterday's dryness. Simple food, nothing that would turn heads in town, but done with a care that did not ask for praise. Outside, the world began to wake proper. Voices carried faint from the road, a door opening, a dog barking once then settling, and somewhere farther off, laughter, the kind that travels easy in the morning air, the town already turning its Thoughts back to the woman who had arrived without a story. Clara did not hurry, did not rush to match the pace of the world outside. She placed the plate in front of him, then took her own seat only after he had reached for his fork, a small thing, the kind most people would not notice. But Ethan did. He noticed the way she waited, not out of habit, but out of something else, something measured. He took a bite, the eggs cooked just right, the bread warm enough to soften without falling apart. And he ate in silence, not the kind that presses on a man, but the kind that gives him space to think. Clara ate the same way, steady, unhurried, her eyes on her plate, but aware of him in the way a person is aware of a presence that does not need to speak to be felt. When the meal was done, she cleared the plates without asking, set them by the basin, and began washing them with the same quiet focus she had given everything else. Ethan washed her hands then, not on purpose, but because something about them did not fit the story the town had already decided for her. They were not soft, but they were not worn in the way of someone who had only ever worked rough land. The movements were precise, efficient, as if she had done this in more than one kind of kitchen, as if she understood more than she let on. He set his cup down slower than usual, the sound of it meeting the table just a little softer, and for the first time since he had brought her home, a thought settled in clear and steady, not loud, not urgent, just there, like a line drawn in the dust, that whatever the town believed about Clara, it was not the whole of her, not even close. By the second day, Red Hollow had already decided what kind of woman Clara Hayes was, and it did not take much for a town like that to settle on a version of the truth that suited them best. The women at Mercer's store spoke in voices dipped just low enough to sound polite, but carried far enough to reach anyone standing within 10 feet. They spoke of her dress, of the way she did not smile, of the fact that she had arrived with only one small bag, as if that alone could measure the worth of a person. The men were quieter about it, but no less certain. They leaned against railings, thumbs hooked in their belts, and nodded to one another in that slow way that said they had already agreed without needing to say much at all. Ethan heard it without being told, not the words exactly, but the shape of them, the way conversation shifted when he walked past, the way eyes followed just a second too long. But he did not stop, did not ask, did not offer anything back, because a man like him understood that talk in a town like this did not need feeding to grow. It would do just fine on its own. Clara moved through her days without stepping into any of it. She did not go into town, did not seek out company, did not stand on the porch as if waiting to be seen. She worked instead, and she worked in a way that did not draw attention but changed things all the same. By the afternoon, the fence line nearest the house had been straightened where it had leaned for months, not rebuilt, not replaced, just adjusted in a way that made it stand the way it should have from the start. The water bucket that usually sat by the well had been scrubbed clean, the rope re-wrapped where it had frayed, small things, the kind that did not shout for notice but settled into the land like they had always belonged. Ethan found them as he moved through his usual work, each one quiet, each one exact, and each one leaving him with the same thought that had begun the night before, that she saw things, not just looked at them, but saw them in a way that most people did not bother to. Late that afternoon, a wagon passed along the road, slower than necessary. The driver, a man named Carl Benton, who had never been known to miss a chance at knowing something before everyone else. He tipped his hat as he passed, but his eyes did not leave the yard, did not leave Clara where she stood near the line, her hands resting lightly on the post she had just set right. She did not return the look, did not acknowledge it at all, just turned and carried on as if the road held nothing of interest to her. Carl drove on, but not before taking a long enough look to carry back into town. And by evening the story had shifted again. Now it was not just that Ethan had brought home a woman no one knew. It was that she thought herself too good to be known, that she kept to herself because she had something to hide. That silence in a woman was not dignity but pride. And pride was something Red Hollow did not forgive easily. Inside the house the light softened as the sun dropped behind the hills, the kind of light that turned dust in the air into something almost golden. Clara set the table again. 2 plates, same as before. No hesitation, no question. Ethan washed his hands and took his seat. And though neither of them spoke of the town or the looks or the quiet weight of it all, it was there in the room between them, not heavy, not pressing, just present, like the wind outside that never truly stopped. And when she poured the coffee and set it in front of him, her hand steady, her eyes calm, it carried something unspoken, not defiance, not apology, just a kind of certainty that did not bend to what others might think. And Ethan, watching her in that quiet way of his, understood something then that he had not needed words to explain, that whatever storm the town thought it was stirring up around her, it had not reached her at all, not yet, and maybe not ever. By the third day, the rhythm of the house had settled into something that felt less like arrangement and more like habit, the kind that forms without being spoken. Clara moved through each task with the same steady pace, never rushing, never lingering, and yet by mid-morning the place carried a sense of order that had not been there before. The porch had been swept clean down to the edges where dust usually gathered in thin lines, the window glass, once clouded with months of neglect, now let the light in clear and unbroken, and the small shelf near the door, where Ethan had always dropped whatever he carried without much thought, had been cleared and set right, not emptied, just arranged in a way that made each thing easier to find, easier to use. Ethan noticed it all the way a man notices a change in weather, not all at once, but in pieces, each one adding up to something he could not ignore. He said nothing about it, not because he did not see it, but because he did not yet know what to make of it. Clara did not look for acknowledgement. She did not pause to see if he would comment. She simply moved from one task to the next as if the work itself was enough. Around midday, Ethan saddled his horse and rode into town, not for supplies, not for any pressing need, just because there were things a man had to do now and then to keep a place running. Even if he would have preferred to leave them undone, Red Hollow met him the same way it always did, with a kind of watchful stillness that broke into quiet talk the moment he passed. He tied his horse outside the general store and stepped inside, the bell above the door giving a small ring that drew a few glances his way. Carl Benton stood near the counter, turning a length of rope in his hands like he had nowhere better to be, and when Ethan walked in, Carl gave a slow nod, the kind that carried more meaning than greeting. "You settling in all right?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. Ethan reached for a sack of flour without answering right away, set it on the counter, then said it is fine. Carl shifted his weight, glanced toward the window as if measuring his next words. "Town is talking," he said, not unkindly, just stating a fact the way men did when they wanted to see how much of it would be denied. Ethan did not look up. "Let them," he said, his tone flat. Carl let out a breath that might have been a laugh, might have been something else. "They are wondering why she does not come into town." Ethan set coins on the counter, more than enough, and pushed them forward. "Maybe she has no reason to," he said. Carl studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once, as if that answered more than he had expected. Outside, the sun sat high and hard, the kind that pulled the color from the land and left everything looking sharper than it felt. Ethan mounted his horse and rode back the same way he had come, dust rising in slow clouds behind him. When he reached the house, Clara was near the back, kneeling by a patch of ground that had once been a garden but had long since gone dry and uneven. She had turned the soil in neat rows, not deep, not heavy, just enough to loosen what had been packed too tight. He watched her for a moment before dismounting, the way her hands moved through the dirt, careful, deliberate, not the motion of someone guessing, but of someone who understood what the land needed. He led the horse to the post and tied it off, then stepped closer. "You plan to plant something there?" he asked, not as a challenge, just as a question that had found its way out. Clara sat back on her heels, brushed her hands together once, the dry earth falling away in small lines. "Yes," she said, her voice even. "What kind?" he asked. She looked at the rose, then back at him. "Something that will grow here," she said. Simple as that. No explanation, no list, just the certainty of it. Ethan stood there a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement exactly, but not doubt either. And as he turned to carry the sack inside, he realized that whatever the town thought it knew about the woman he had brought home, it did not include this. This quiet way she moved through a place and left it better than she had found it without ever asking to be seen doing it. By the fourth day, the town had grown restless in a quiet sort of way, the kind that does not raise its voice but leans in closer, watching for something to confirm what it already believes. And when something does not come, it begins to create it instead, Mrs. Harlan was the first to make the suggestion out loud, standing near the doorway of the mercantile with a basket hooked over her arm, saying it plain enough for anyone passing to hear that a woman who keeps to herself must have a reason for it. And reasons like that were rarely good. The others did not argue. They rarely did when a thought fit too neatly into what they had already decided. They only added to it in small ways, a nod here, a glance there, until it settled into something that felt like truth. By late afternoon, the idea had taken shape into an invitation, if it could be called that, a gathering at the town hall 2 nights from then, nothing formal, just music, food, and the usual talk that filled long evenings. When the work was done, but beneath it sat something else, something quieter and sharper, a chance to see the woman Ethan Hayes had brought home, to place her in a room where she could not remain unseen. The message reached Ethan the same way everything in Red Hollow did, not directly, but through a man who stopped him near the well with a casual tone that carried just enough weight to make it clear it was expected. "There is a gathering come Friday," he said. "Folks would like to meet your wife." Ethan did not answer right away. He looked past the man toward the road, the dust settling from a wagon that had passed minutes before. Then he said, "We will see," which in Red Hollow could mean anything from agreement to refusal. And the man took it as enough, carried it back into town where it would be shaped into certainty before the sun went down. When Ethan returned home that evening, the sky had already begun to soften, the hard edge of day giving way to that quiet hour where everything slows just enough to be noticed. Clara stood by the porch, a small bundle of cloth in her hands, mending something with careful, even stitches, the needle moving in and out with a rhythm that did not falter. He tied off his horse and stepped up beside her. "There is a gathering in town on Friday," he said. Not as an order, not even as a request, just placing the words where they could be considered. Clara did not stop her work right away. She finished the stitch she was on, pulled the thread through, then looked up at him, her expression the same as it had been since the day she arrived. Calm, steady, unreadable in a way that did not invite questions. "Do you want to go?" she asked, her voice even. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the post, the wood warm from the day's sun. "It is not about what I want," he said. "They will expect it." Clara nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding, the kind that does not need explanation. She folded the cloth neatly, set it beside her, and said, "Then we will go." Just like that. No hesitation, no concern, as if stepping into a room full of people who had already judged her was no different than setting 2 plates on a table. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, something in his chest tightening again, not from worry exactly, but from the sense that he was about to see something he did not yet understand. Inside, the house carried the same quiet it had begun to learn, the stove warm, the table set, 2 plates waiting as they always did now. And as they sat across from each other, the light from the lamp casting a soft glow over the worn wood, neither of them spoke of what Friday might bring, but it sat there between them all the same, not heavy, not pressing, just present, like a door that had not yet been opened but could not be ignored once it had been seen. Friday came in with a kind of stillness that did not belong to the weather. The air was warm enough, the sky clear in that wide, open way that stretched from one end of the valley to the other. But there was something beneath it all, something that moved quieter than wind and settled heavier than dust, the kind of feeling that comes before a door opens and everyone inside knows it will not close the same way again. Clara rose that morning as she always did, before the sun had fully claimed the horizon. She lit the stove, ground the coffee, set the table with the same steady hands. Nothing in her movements suggested that the day would be any different from the ones before it. And yet Ethan found himself watching more closely than usual, noticing things he had already noticed, the way she measured without looking, the way she waited before sitting, the way she moved through the space like she understood not just what needed doing, but why. He drank his coffee slower that morning, not because it was different, but because something in him was trying to hold on to the quiet before the town had its say. Outside, Red Hollow had begun its own kind of preparation, not with decorations or announcements, but with talk that slipped from one porch to another, from one counter to the next, shaping itself into expectation. By midday, it was understood that Ethan Hayes would be there, and more importantly, that his wife would be seen, truly seen, not from a distance, not in passing, but in a room where every eye could settle and every judgment could find its place. Clara spent the afternoon much the same as she had the others, tending to the small garden rose she had turned, checking the fence line once more, mending a shirt with the same quiet precision when the sun began its slow drop behind the hills. She set aside her work and stepped inside. There was no elaborate preparation, no searching through belongings for something finer. She wore the same calico dress, brushed clean, mended where needed, her hair pinned as it always was, practical, steady. When Ethan saw her standing there, ready in that simple way, he felt that same tightening in his chest, not doubt, not worry, just the awareness that she was walking into something most would try to dress themselves against, and she had chosen not to. They rode into town as the lights softened, the road familiar beneath the horses' hooves, dust rising in slow, golden clouds behind them. The town hall stood at the far end of Main Street, lanterns already lit, their glow spilling out into the evening. People gathered in small clusters outside, voices low, laughter carried just enough to sound easy. But there was a pause when Ethan and Clara approached, not sudden, not sharp, just a shift, like a room adjusting to a new presence. He dismounted first, offered his hand without looking at her, and she took it without hesitation, her grip steady, her step sure as she came down beside him. They walked in together, not close enough to touch, but not apart either. The hall was warm with bodies and lamplight, tables set along the sides with simple food, a fiddle resting near the far wall where a man tuned it absent-mindedly. Conversations dipped and rose as they entered, eyes turning, not all at once, but in waves. Clara did not look away. She did not lower her gaze or search for a place to hide. She simply walked beside Ethan and took in the room as it was, as if she had every right to stand there among them. A few women near the center shifted slightly, making space that was not quite welcoming, not quite closed, just enough to mark her presence. And in that moment, the town began its quiet work, measuring, weighing, deciding, waiting for something to confirm what they had already chosen to believe. And Clara, standing there in the middle of it all, did nothing at all to change their minds. She did not speak, did not explain, did not offer herself up to their curiosity. She only stood, calm and steady, like a still point in a room that had yet to realize it was about to change. There is a way a room can turn on a person without ever raising its voice. And that night in the hall, it began in small pieces, not all at once. A glance held a second too long, a smile that did not reach the eyes, a pause in conversation just as Clara passed within earshot, the kind of things that could be dismissed if taken alone, but gathered weight when they came one after another. Ethan felt it before he saw it. The shift in the air around them, the way space opened not out of welcome but out of distance. He stood near the edge of the room, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, his presence steady, unmoved, while Clara stood beside him with that same quiet composure she had carried since the day she arrived. The fiddle began to play, a slow tune at first, then something lighter as couples moved to the center of the floor, boots against wood, skirts brushing in soft arcs, laughter rising just enough to fill the room without breaking its shape. Clara watched, not with longing, not with discomfort, just with a calm attention, as if she were taking in a scene she had seen before in a different place. Across the room, Mrs. Harlan leaned toward another woman, her voice low but not low enough. "I suppose she does not dance," she said, and the other woman let out a small sound that might have been agreement, might have been something closer to amusement. Clara did not turn, did not react. Her gaze remained on the movement of the room, but something in Ethan tightened, not anger, not quite, just the awareness that the night was unfolding exactly as the town had intended. A man approached then, younger, his hat in his hands, not unkind, just curious in the way men sometimes are when they think they are being polite. "Ma'am," he said, his voice careful, "would you care for a dance?" Clara looked at him then, really looked, her eyes steady, not soft, not hard, just present. And for a moment the man seemed unsure of what he had stepped into. She shook her head once, a small movement. "Thank you," she said, her voice even. "I will watch." The man nodded quickly, stepped back, and returned to the floor, but the exchange did not go unnoticed. It never did in a place like this. And soon enough the whispers shifted again. Now it was not just that she kept to herself, but that she thought herself above what was offered, that she refused not out of shyness but out of judgment, the story reshaping itself to fit whatever gap had been left open. Clara remained where she was, her hands resting lightly in front of her, fingers still, not fidgeting, not betraying anything that might give the room more to hold on to. Ethan moved slightly closer then, not enough to draw attention, just enough that if anyone were watching, and many were, they would see it as what it was, a choice, not protective in a way that would invite challenge, but steady in a way that made one think twice before stepping further. The music carried on, the night stretching, the room filling and shifting, and through it all, Clara did not bend to it, did not fill the silence with explanation, did not offer herself up to be understood on their terms. She simply stood, present and unchanging, while the town, piece by piece, revealed more about itself than it ever would about her.